They say family is a safe harbor, a place where you are loved not for your achievements, but simply because you exist. We are used to believing that blood ties are the strongest fabric in the universe. But what if that fabric is nothing more than a thin theatrical prop? What if the person smiling at you across a celebratory dinner table has already scouted the location for your grave? December 2003, Sugar Land, Texas. The name of the city itself suggests sweetness, and the lives of the Whitaker family perfectly matched that image. Success, wealth, 2 wonderful sons, and a luxurious home in a gated community where even the shadows seem neatly trimmed. That evening, they were celebrating. They were celebrating what every parent guides their child toward for years, their eldest son, Bart, graduating from college. Laughter at Papacito's cantina, the clinking of glasses, the pride in the eyes of a father and mother. They don't know yet that this dinner is their last. They don't know that the diploma Bart is talking about so passionately doesn't even exist. They don't know that for several years, their son has been leading a double life, turning reality into a massive psychological thriller. And while Kent and Trisha Whitaker were paying the check, looking forward to a cozy evening at home, something was already lurking in the darkness of their foyer, something hired by their own child. Today, we will try to understand, how did a golden boy turn into the cold-blooded director of his own family's massacre? And why did a father who lost everything that night decide that his only remaining mission was to save his executioner from the death penalty? This is the story of Thomas Bart Whitaker, a story of a fake graduation, real blood, and a forgiveness that borders on madness. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Sugar Land isn't just a suburb of Houston. It is the embodiment of the American dream, cast in concrete and decorated with perfect lawns. Here, doors aren't locked, and the crime rate is so low that the biggest event of the week might be an improperly parked golf cart. This is where the Whitaker family lived, in the prestigious Lake Point neighborhood. The head of the family, Kent Whitaker, was the picture of stability. A successful accountant and a deeply religious man, he built his life on the principles of honesty and hard work. His wife, Trisha, was the heart of the home, a loving, gentle woman who adored her sons. They had everything: a substantial bank account, the respect of their peers, and 2 sons who seemingly inherited their parents' best traits. The younger, Kevin, was the life of the party. The eldest, Bart, was the pride of the family. Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, born in 1972, was accustomed to the best from childhood. His parents didn't just love him, they invested in him. Private schools, top-tier camps, expensive gifts. Bart grew up to be a charismatic, intelligent, and incredibly persuasive young man. Those around him saw a future leader, a man for whom every door was open. But somewhere deep inside, beneath that flawless shell, a crack began to grow. Bart had a strange trait. He could not stand failure. Not in the sense that he strove for perfection, but in the sense that he could not admit when something went wrong. For him, it was easier to build a labyrinth of lies than to say to his father, "Dad, I made a mistake." After high school, Bart enrolled at Baylor University, but soon transferred to Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, ironically, the city that houses the most famous prison in Texas. His parents dutifully paid the tuition bills, providing money for books, housing, and living expenses. Bart regularly came home talking about his academic successes, difficult exams, and demanding professors. Kent Whitaker, used to trusting people, never even thought to check his son's transcripts. Why would he? Bart was a mature, responsible man. But the truth was that Bart Whitaker had stopped being a student during his very first semester. He had been expelled for academic failure almost immediately. However, Bart didn't pack his bags and return home with a confession. He did something much more complex. Every day for several years, he pretended to go to class. He bought textbooks and read them so he could hold conversations about subjects he never attended. He forged letters from the university and grade reports. Imagine the level of psychological tension. Year after year, month after month, you wake up in Huntsville, knowing that your life is a house of cards. Bart lived about 70 miles away from his parents, and that distance allowed him to maintain the illusion. He spent his parents' money on expensive clothes, watches, and outings with friends, while Kent and Tricia were certain their son was grinding the granite of science. Bart wasn't just a liar. He was the architect of an alternative reality. His friends at the university also believed he was a student. He stepped into the role so deeply that it seemed he began to believe his own legend. But every lie has an expiration date, and that date was called graduation. By 2003, Bart realized he had reached a dead end. His parents were expecting a commencement ceremony in December. They planned to invite relatives and book a table at a top restaurant. Bart had no diploma. He didn't even have student status. If the truth came out, his perfect world would collapse. He would lose his financial support, and more importantly, he would lose the admiration he saw in his father's eyes. For most people, the way out would be a confession, a difficult conversation, tears, perhaps a period of estrangement. But life goes on. However, in the mind of Bart Whitaker, a different plan took shape. If there is no family, there is no need for excuses. He began thinking about murdering his loved ones long before that fateful December. It wasn't a spontaneous burst of rage. It was a cold, mathematical calculation. Bart began looking for those who would help him solve the problem. He sought executors among his acquaintances, carefully feeling out the ground, talking about an inheritance that would total more than $1 million. He didn't just want to hide his lie. He wanted to be rewarded for keeping it. The atmosphere in the Whitaker home in early December 2003 was upbeat. Tricia was buying a new dress for the celebration. Kevin was preparing a gift for his older brother. Kent proudly told colleagues that Bart was finally entering the professional world. Meanwhile, Bart was finalizing details with Chris Brazelton and Stephen Champagne, the men he chose as his accomplices. Bart detailed the timing, who stands where, who opens fire, how the botched robbery scene should look. He even arranged to be wounded himself to deflect suspicion. December 10th. There was a typical Texas chill in the air. The family gathered to head to the restaurant. Bart was smiling. He was cheerful and outgoing. He had just finished his last exam. In reality, all he had handed over that day were the keys to his parents' home, given to a man with a gun in his hand. In any tragedy like this, there is always a period that investigators later call the calm before the storm. For the Whitaker family, this calm stretched on for years. Looking at them from the outside, you would see the embodiment of harmony. Kent and Tricia didn't just love their children, they were enchanted by them. Bart, as the eldest, always set the bar. He was that gold standard by which success was measured in their social circle. But if we look closer at the relationships within this home, we see something strange. It was a love built on absolute trust that bordered on blindness. Kent Whitaker believed that honesty was the foundation of their family. He couldn't have imagined that beneath this foundation, Bart had long ago dug a deep, rotten pit. Their relationship resembled a complex dance. The parents gave Bart everything: freedom, finances, support. In return, Bart gave them a flawless image. He was polite, religious, and always ready to help. But behind this mask hid a man who felt not gratitude toward his loved ones, but a growing, hollow irritation. He was burdened by the need to constantly meet their expectations. Their kindness infuriated him because it made him feel obligated. The first truly alarming bells rang back in 2001, 2 years before the finale. Bart had already begun weaving his deadly web back then. He tried to hire an acquaintance to kill his family. The plan fell through only because the potential executor got scared and informed the police. You might ask, how could they continue living as if nothing happened after such a thing? Here lies the main mystery of the Whitaker family. When the police came to Kent and told him that his son might be plotting something horrific, the father simply didn't believe it. He talked to Bart, and Bart, this great master of manipulation, convinced his father with tears in his eyes that it was just a misunderstanding. He claimed he was depressed, that he was just talking nonsense from stress. Kent, wanting to save his child, chose to believe a lie instead of the frightening truth. He didn't just forgive his son, he erased the incident from his memory as if it had never happened. From that moment on, Bart realized he was invincible. If he could convince them of his innocence after a direct tip-off, it meant he could do anything. The lie about the university became his full-time job. Every morning, Bart woke up in his apartment, paid for by his father, put on a clean shirt, and pretended to leave for lectures. In reality, he could sit for hours in coffee shops or shopping malls, simply watching people. He spent thousands of dollars on top-tier designer clothes and expensive watches, convincing his parents these were awards for academic excellence or the result of his successful investments in the stock market. While his brother Kevin was actually working hard and making plans for the future, Bart lived in a vacuum. He surrounded himself with people he could manipulate. Chris Brazelton and Stephen Champagne were not his friends in the traditional sense. They were his tools. He processed them for months, convincing them that his parents were tyrants who were breaking his life. He promised them a share of an inheritance estimated at several $1,000,000. Bart sold them the death of his loved ones as a business project. Kent Whitaker later recalled that Bart sometimes seemed distant. No, he brushed it off as the hardships of studying and preparing for graduation. Tricia, for her part, tried to surround her eldest son with even more care. She wrote him touching notes and put together gift baskets. She loved a person who did not exist. The fall of 2003 became the time for final assembly. Bart knew that the commencement ceremony was scheduled for December. He had no way out. University officials had long ago removed his name from all lists, but Kent and Tricia continued to plan the celebration. They had already bought a gift for their son, a luxury Rolex watch that Kent planned to place on his wrist after the formal procession. The tension inside Bart reached its peak. He could not allow the shame. In his distorted perception of reality, murder was a more acceptable option than admitting he was a failure. He began conducting rehearsals with his accomplices. They came to the house in Sugarland at night, studied the layout of the rooms, and planned escape routes. Bart even pointed out the spot in his old room where his father's .40 caliber pistol was kept. It was from this weapon that he decided to kill those who gave him life. This wasn't hatred in its purest form. It was cold egocentrism. Bart wanted to maintain his golden boy status at any cost. And if that required his mother to choke on her own blood on the floor of their cozy living room, well, that was a price he was willing to pay. Others would pay it, not him. While Kent Whitaker proudly booked a table at the restaurant for December 10th, Bart Whitaker was checking if there were enough rounds in the Pistols magazine. He continued to smile at dinner, discussing career plans after graduation, while a countdown timer was already ticking in his head. There were only a few days left in the lives of the Whitaker family. December 10th, 2003. A typical Texas Wednesday that should have been a triumph, but instead, it turned into a funeral march. Throughout that day, Bart Whitaker remained in a state of strange, almost frighteningly calm. He already knew the gears were in motion, and there was no turning back. That evening, the Whitaker family gathered in full. They looked like a living advertisement for American prosperity, a successful father, a radiant mother, and 2 grown sons. For Kent and Tricia, the night was overflowing with pride. Their firstborn had graduated from the university. They headed to Papacito's Cantina in Stafford, just a few miles from their home. Inside the restaurant, it was noisy, filled with the scent of spices and tequila. Bart, was the life of the party. He ordered the food, cracked jokes, and accepted congratulations. Kent would later recall that his son looked absolutely happy. At one point, Kent handed Bart a box. Inside was a Rolex watch, a symbol of his transition into a successful adult life. Bart slipped it onto his wrist, thanked his father, and kept on laughing. In his pocket, however, his cell phone was vibrating with short messages from Chris Brazier. The killer was already in position. Around 8 p.m., the family left the restaurant. The drive to their home in the prestigious Sugarland neighborhood took only about 10 to 15 minutes. As their SUV pulled into the driveway, Bart intentionally lingered by the vehicle. He claimed he had forgotten his keys or something of the sort, a classic maneuver to ensure he wouldn't be the first to enter the house. 19-year-old Kevin was the first to cross the threshold. Tricia followed closely behind him. Kent brought up the rear. The moment Kevin stepped into the dark foyer, a masked figure stepped out of the shadows. Chris Brazier did not hesitate. The first shot rang out. A .40 caliber bullet struck Kevin directly in the chest. The young man collapsed to the floor, never even having a chance to understand what was happening. Tricia let out a scream, but the next shot silenced her forever. She fell right next to her son. Kent, hearing the thunderous noise, which he would later describe as the sound of 1,000 light bulbs exploding, struggled to grasp reality. He saw a flash and felt a sharp impact in his chest. The bullet passed clean through, piercing his lung. Kent stumbled and fell on the porch of his home, bleeding out under the glow of the street lamp. Finally, Bart ran into the house. This was part of his script, the staging of a struggle. He grappled with Brazier, and the gunman shot him in the arm, just as they had agreed. Bart fell, playing the part of the victim, while the executor fled through the back door and vanished into the night, taking the only loot with him, the murder weapon itself. When the police arrived, they found a horrific scene. Kevin was dead. Tricia was still breathing, but her life was fading with every passing second. Kent lay on the grass, fighting for a single breath of air. And amidst this nightmare stood Bart, the lone witness, miraculously surviving this bloodbath. The scene was chaotic. Paramedics fought to save Tricia, preparing her for an emergency life flight to Memorial Hermann Hospital. Kent and Bart were rushed away in separate ambulances. All of Sugarland stood still. News of a quadruple shooting in one of the city's most elite enclaves spread like wildfire. It seemed impossible. People stepped out onto their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering in fear. Had true evil finally pierced their Sugarland? As police cordoned off the house, the search began. But that night, they were hunting a phantom. From their hospital beds, Bart and Kent gave their initial statements, describing a tall man in black clothing and a ski mask. Bart added a key detail designed to mislead investigators. He, confidently, stated that the attacker was a black man. Officers with K-9 units scoured the area, and helicopters with thermal imaging circled the woods and lake shores, but the killer seemed to have vanished into the Texas night. At the hospital, Kent Whitaker regained consciousness after surgery. The bullet had passed just 2 inches from his heart, lodging in his shoulder. His first thought was his family. But the news was soul-crushing. Kevin had died at the scene. Tricia passed away at the hospital without ever waking up. Of the entire family, only he and Bart remained. In those early days, the city's panic turned into deep mourning. More than 1,000 people gathered for Tricia and Kevin's funeral. It was a sea of tears and unspoken rage. Friends and relatives embraced Kent and Bart as they stood before 2 caskets. Bart looked devastated. He wore a bandage over his gunshot wound, accepted condolences, and wept alongside everyone else. He was the perfect survivor, the grieving son who lost a mother and a brother in a random robbery. But while the city prayed for the departed, lead detective Marshall Slott was already noticing strange, almost invisible threads in the case. The hunt for an outside enemy was yielding nothing, and the police found themselves returning to the house more and more. They were looking for a robber, but they started finding lies. A lot of lies. First, there were no signs of forced entry. The perpetrator had walked into the home as if they had a key. Second, and most baffling, was the fact that almost nothing of value had been taken. The only item missing was the specific .40 caliber pistol, the very weapon used to execute the family. Professional burglars do not leave behind a safe full of jewelry just to steal a single handgun. It looked less like a botched robbery and more like a calculated assassination. Slot decided to look into the very core of the evening's celebration, Bart's graduation. He contacted the university to confirm the young man's credentials. It was the moment the entire house of cards began to sway. "Bart Whitaker?" The administrator's voice was flat. "Detective, he isn't a student here. He was dismissed for academic failure years ago. There was no degree to be handed out this December." The graduation dinner at Papacito's Cantina had been a total fabrication. If his parents were on the verge of discovering his secret life, Bart had the oldest motive in the book, hiding his shame by any means necessary. Investigators began to dig and unearthed a pattern of behavior. They found a history of Bart trying to hire someone to solve his problems as early as 2001, a dark secret the family had tried to bury. But Bart was no amateur. He played the part of the grieving survivor to the hilt, even as he began spending insurance money on new luxuries. The breakthrough finally came through digital footprints. Authorities recovered deleted messages and phone records that the perpetrators thought were gone forever. These records led straight to his inner circle. When faced with the cold reality of a capital murder charge, his accomplices began to break. They detailed the months of planning. They described how the shooter was given access to the house through a window and provided with the family's own weapon. They even explained the orchestrated struggle where Bart was shot in the arm to look like a victim. By the time warrants were issued in June 2004, Bart was gone. He had fled across the border, settling in the town of Cerralvo, Mexico, under the name Rudy Rios. For 15 months, he lived a new life, charming the locals and even finding a girlfriend, convinced the blood on his hands had washed away. But Slot never stopped hunting. He worked with Mexican authorities, and eventually the Golden Boy was cornered. As he was led back toward the Texas border, Bart remained eerily calm, unaware that his own father was already preparing for a different kind of battle. Prosecutors began the process with a detailed reconstruction of the events. They presented the jury not just with dry facts, but with a vivid picture of betrayal. Stephen Champagne, the driver who had taken a plea deal, became the star witness for the prosecution. He received 15 years in prison, but his testimony became Bart's death warrant. Stephen described how Bart stood on the threshold of the house, how he cold-bloodedly pointed out exactly where the bodies of his mother and brother should lie. Chris Brazier, the direct executioner, received a life sentence. But all eyes were on the director. The prosecution proved that Bart didn't just want to hide the lie about his university status. He wanted an inheritance worth roughly $1.5 million, which would have allowed him to continue a life of luxury without ever working a day. To him, his family was merely an obstacle between him and a bank account. However, the most shocking moment of the trial wasn't the evidence. It was the words of Kent Whitaker. Imagine a man who lost his beloved wife and his youngest son. A man who was nearly killed by his own firstborn. Kent stepped up to the podium and, looking the jurors in the eye, spoke words that made the room fall silent. He didn't demand revenge. He asked to spare the life of his executioner. "I am not justifying what he did," Kent said, struggling to contain his emotions. "But Bart is all I have left of my family. If you execute him, you are simply finishing what that killer in the mask started. You will be killing the last part of my life." It was an unheard-of situation for Texas. a state known for its eye for an eye approach to capital murder. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. Despite the father's pleas, the weight of the crime was too heavy. Bart Whitaker was found guilty of capital murder for remuneration. The sentence, death by lethal injection. As the judge read the verdict, Bart didn't flinch. He merely gave a slight nod, as if it were just another role he had to play. He was transported to the Polunsky unit, the highest security prison in Texas, to await his meeting with the executioner. But the story of Bart Whitaker didn't end there. While he counted his days on death row, his father began his own battle. A battle against the entire legal machinery of Texas that would last for 11 long years. Kent visited Bart every single week. There was always a thick sheet of bulletproof glass between them, but the father said that through that glass, he saw a man who had truly repented. While in prison, Bart earned 2 college degrees, helped other inmates, and wrote letters to his father filled with remorse. But the law of the state remained relentless. The execution date was set for February 22, 2018. On that day, Bart ate his last meal. He had already been moved to the death watch cell, just a few hundred feet from the execution chamber. Kent Whitaker stood outside, surrounded by reporters, making one final plea for mercy. And then, something unprecedented happened. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which has only recommended clemency a handful of times in decades, voted unanimously, 7-0, to recommend commuting the sentence to life in prison. It was a shock to the system, but the final word belonged to Governor Greg Abbott. Just 40 minutes before the lethal chemicals were to be injected into Bart's veins, the phone in the death chamber rang. Governor Abbott signed the clemency proclamation. Bart Whitaker became the first person in Texas history to have his execution stayed solely at the request of the victim of the crime. Many in Texas considered the decision an injustice. Critics argued that Bart was a master manipulator who had managed to deceive both his father and the justice system one last time. They pointed to Tricia and Kevin, whose voices were silenced forever on that December night. An eye for an eye. That ancient formula still echoes in our collective consciousness. But Kent Whitaker chose a different path. Today, Bart Whitaker is serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free, never again see the sugar land he once called home. Is this the triumph of love or the ultimate victory of a gifted liar? There is no simple answer. Kent Whitaker says his forgiveness wasn't a gift to his son, but a gift to himself, a way to avoid being consumed by the flames of hatred. In this story, there is no happy ending. There is only the silence of prison corridors and a father who still travels 70 miles every week just to look into the eyes of the man who took everything from him and whom he chose to keep alive anyway. In the end, the most terrifying ghosts are the ones we refuse to let go. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.